So in this video, I'm going to be reminding you about how to multiply polynomials. So a quick warm-up before we begin. There's some basic principles of working with exponents that need to make sense to you. So hopefully you remember that if I take 3 times 3, that I can write that repeated multiplication using the exponent 2, because 3 to the power of 2 really just means 3 times itself, right? So if I use that idea and I apply that with variables, if 3 times 3 is 3 squared, then what is x times itself going to be, right? Well, that's going to be x squared. And, over here I'm seeing that 4 times 4 times 4, I can represent that as 4 to the power 3 because 4 is being multiplied by itself 3 times. So if I apply the same thing here to my x times x times x, then I end up getting x to the power of 3, or x cubed. Okay, now one last thing that needs to make sense to you. I've written in the next line x squared times x, right? So if x times x, I know is going to give me this x squared. And then I'm going to multiply it by another factor of x, right? In the last case, I got x cubed. So, that it stands to reason then, if I follow the same logic, that x squared times an x is just an extra power of x, and that's going to give me x cubed as well. All right, so before we move on, those are some basic ideas that you're going to need to understand moving forward. So the first example we're going to see is the case where you're multiplying a monomial with another monomial. So remember that a monomial is a polynomial with only one term in it. Okay, so I think the rules are fairly straightforward. I'm going to multiply my coefficients with my other coefficients. In other words, the numbers with the numbers. And then I'm going to multiply my variable with my other variable. Let's look at an example to help make sense of this. So in my first example here, I can see that I have 7x times 3x. Okay? So I'm going to multiply my coefficient of 3 with my coefficient of 7 to give me 21. But then I'm also going to multiply my x times my x. As we just saw in the previous warm-up, x times x is going to give me x squared, and I'm done. In the next example, slightly more complicated, but I think manageable. Okay, so again, I'm going to multiply my coefficient with my coefficient, number with number. 2 times 9 gives me 18. Now I'm going to multiply my variables together. So x times x squared, don't want to forget about those. X times x squared will give me x cubed. And I'm done. Lastly, let's do an example that involves integers. If you know your rules for integers, the same rules will apply here. So negative 5 times negative 4. If I have a negative times a negative, that will always give me a positive answer. So that will give me positive 20. Okay, now let's look at our x terms. So x squared times x, as we saw in the warm-up and in the last example, is x cubed. So I've managed to take a look at both my coefficient part and my variable part and each of my monomial multiplications. Now you should be ready to try some practice questions. All right, so here is an example of a problem that you might have to use multiplying monomials. Okay, so the question reads, write an expression for the area of the following rectangle. So because it says area here, feel free to grab your formula worksheet. You will certainly have that available to you for tests and for quizzes. And so you should remember that area is equal to length times width. And so in this case, what I have expressions to represent my length and my width. Instead of actual numbers. So I can't actually get a value for my area unless they tell me the value of the variable. So in this case, I'm simply looking for an expression, not an actual value. And so when I look at this, I have 4x for my length and 2x for my width. And I'm going to multiply these in order to simplify. And that will give me 4 times 2 This is another thinking type question. It asks you to fill in the missing polynomial. Okay, so in this case what I have to do is I have to say to myself, well, what would go in this blank here, in this blank space, in order to give me the answer that I see on the right-hand side of that equation? So a good way to think about it is to say, well, work with your numbers and your variables separately. So I would say, well, 7 times what number is going to give me 14? So I know that that number is 2. Another way to work it out would be to say 14 divided by 7, and the remainder, and the value that I get for that tells me the value that needs to be in that bracket. But now I need to be careful because I'm not quite done. I need to look at the variable component. So I can see that I have an x and times some other variable part that should give me x squared. Well, x times what is going to give me x squared in total? Well, x. And the interesting thing here is that if I go ahead and I try this out, 7 times 2 is actually 14, and x times x is actually x squared. So that's a good way to check to see if your answer makes sense. Let's take a look at the next example. So in the next example, it's a little bit harder. I've got some integers to work with, right? So I can see that my answer is 8x cubed. Let's manage our number first, okay, our coefficient of 8. So I need to think, well, what do I need to multiply -2 by in order to get an 8, a positive 8? So I need to think about a couple things here. I need to remember that the only way that I end up with positive if one of the values is a negative is if the other value is also a negative being multiplied. So a negative times a negative is the only way I'll get a positive out of this. Right? So then I say, well, what 2 times what is going to give me 8? Well, 2 times 4. But I know that the 4 has to be negative in this case to give me positive 8 at the end. Okay, secondly, I need to look at x. I end up with an x over here and an x cubed at the end of it all. And so that tells me that I need to make sure that I have 2 more factors of x in my second monomial. So I'm going to write that as 4x squared. Now let's go ahead and check. -2 times -4 does in fact give me positive 8. X times x squared does in fact give me x cubed. So I'm done. After these examples, you should be ready to try some of the questions involving multiplying monomials with other monomials. That will be a good search for you on the internet if you're looking for extra practice, multiplying monomials with monomials.